Welcome to Magicians Talking Magic. My name is Ryan Joyce, and on this episode, we're talking with International Champion of Magic, Greg Frewin. Don't forget to join us in Discord and subscribe on YouTube. All links in the description. Well, let's jump in right here, talking about the world's greatest magic. That was my first introduction to you, was seeing you on World's Greatest Magic. What was that experience like?
You know, World's Greatest Magic was probably the most, it was very interesting, a very surreal thing in my life, because Gary Ouellette told me about it at FISM. And at the time, it was just, he was working on it. And I was like, oh, and I was thinking in my head, okay, a TV show, whatever. And then about 6 months later, I might not be right on the exact time, but not too long later, I got a phone call. I was on a cruise ship, and he called me on my ship in the cabin. And you know how difficult that is. And he says, can you get to Las Vegas by such and such a date? It was only a month later. And I said, yeah, I guess. And next thing I know, we're landing in Vegas, getting picked up by a limo. All my cases are stuck out the back of the limo, and I got doves all in which is the most bizarre thing to show up at Caesar's Magical Empire with all these things. And then at the time, my wife's green card hadn't been approved. Mine had been, but hers hadn't. And so I needed to have an assistant. And I asked, Gary knew about it. And next thing I know, my assistant arrives with Lance Burton, and it was one of his assistants that he had loaned me for the show, which to this day was the most amazing, it was just, so the whole experience was just, I went from thinking magic is really cool to magic is superly really cool. And so, yeah, it was just a really cool experience all around.
I can't imagine how that would have changed a career, also that exposure, because those were the biggest things in November Thanksgiving season, right? Like, it was massive.
Sure. And the interesting thing about it was I was very new at, obviously it was my first big TV thing. I mean, I'd done the local Stony Creek Jeannie Craig show, which I think had about 12 watchers at the time or whatever. But I thought after the NBC special, I'd be walking in the mall and people would recognize me, but that didn't happen. But what did happen was the agents and the bookers and the cruise lines and people like that knew now. And when you sent your tape, you weren't in a big stack of tapes. It got right to the top, and it got, so it definitely helped in the career and in moving forward, stuff like that. So great experience.
Gary Ouellette, another fellow Canadian.
Gary Ouellette. Oh yeah. Big, man. I spent a lot of time with Gary, and probably one of the nicest men in magic, so sharing and giving. He was just great. Very smart and very driven. I mean, I've never seen a guy with more passion for magic and more drive to keep going. He would be on a set from morning, you go to bed. I remember Monte Carlo at Champions of Magic, and we were shooting stuff, and it was going all day. And then I decided to go down and watch, I can't remember who was shooting at night. It was 3 a.m. I think it might've been Steve Wyrick and his Blades of Death. And I'm thinking, and there's Gary right in the front, still with the same smile, with his coffee and his cigarette. And he's like, hey, what? And so, I mean, magic, when we lost Gary, we lost a big part of magic. We really did.
We served together on the executive of the Canadian Association of Magicians. And that was, of course, founded by Joan Caesar. And you provided some motivation for that. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's funny you say provided, because it wasn't intentional, but yeah. So, it was an interesting story, because when I went to FISM in '94 in Yokohama, Japan, I competed and I was in the general category, and I won first place in my category. And how FISM works is the top marks of all the different categories gets an extra prize called the Grand Prix, for those that don't know what that is. And I actually had the top marks, and I was awarded the Grand Prix by marks, but then they took away points because I was Canadian, and there was no association of magicians that were affiliated apparently with FISM, which is really strange, because I'm not sure why they allowed me in the competition, but either way. So when I came home, I was telling Joan Caesar the story. She had her son, Ben Caesar, was over at my house doing a little practice, and I was working with him a bit on his act. And I told her the story, and I could see the turn. And we chatted a little bit, and I said, at one point I said, there should be an association of magicians for Canadians so that this wouldn't ever happen again. And she didn't say anything at that time. But then about 6 or 8 months later, all of a sudden, there's this CAM thing. I'm like, what's CAM? What's this CAM? And then I realized Joan had created something that's kind of an amazing thing for Canadian magicians.
Yeah, and that I can't recall the exact year off the top of my head, but certainly in the 90s. And here we are, many over 20 years later, and the organization is still representing Canadian magicians around the world. Why do you think this is important? Why do you think organizations like these are important?
Well, Ryan, I think any organization that's like an organization that's there to help, especially young people or I like to say more young magicians, not in age, but in their their time they've been with magic, is a great thing, because it's a little easier now for people to get that information about how tricks are done and stuff like that. But there's a lot missing from just reading a trick in a book. And I think the great thing about organizations is you have different people. Like, for example, in our organization, there's you, there's myself. We have different people that have different life histories and how we performed and what we've done in magic. And we can share that with these young magicians or young new magicians that are just starting. And I think that's a great way to help sort of spread the seeds of magic. Because, in the end of the day, I think we all want magic to be great in all ways, because I remember the first time I saw a professional magician, I was 12. We talked about it the other night, seeing Doug Hennings live, and it changed my life. So I think organizations like this are great.
Yeah, and well, let's talk about the beginnings, because how does your interest in magic begin? Where did that start?
Well, Doug Hennings wasn't my first sort of real interest in magic, but I had I'm trying to remember, it was the magic hat kit that was out on a TV commercial that came with a hat, and they poured the milk in, and then you put the hat on your head. And of course, I asked for it for Christmas because it was the coolest thing ever. And the milk always ran down and my mom used to just clap and be, "Oh, you're so good." But, it was just a young kid playing with some magic. But at 12 years old, my grandfather took me to see Doug Hennings, and I'd never seen anything like that. It was at the Hummingbird Theater in Toronto, and it changed my life.
And so, like, no other influences magic-wise in your family? No other entertainers or anything?
My grandfather, he used to do little coin tricks, nothing great, little quick whatever, pull it out of your ear. And he was the one that took me to see Doug. So I think for him, he always had an interest in magic, but he wasn't per se a magician. Yeah.
So what happened after that? How did you end up basically from that introduction to magic to competing, for example? What's that timeline look?
Well, it's like an addict. It went from 2 tricks to 4 tricks a day to 10 tricks a day to I can't go to bed at night because I'm thinking about the tricks and I'm trying to create different ones. Really, I remember, going to the libraries, and back then we didn't have the internet, right? So I would go to libraries trying to find books on magic, and I exhausted there wasn't very many we were in a small town in Stony Creek. So I exhausted all those books very quick. And a lot of it is stuff that I couldn't do because, you open these books up, and as a 12-year-old or 13-year-old kid, where do you get some of these props, right? Like decks of cards, easy. But how do you get like a bowl of fish or make it appear on a table with this foulard and all this? And I didn't even know what a foulard was. So, right. So, it was the point where I was really struggling to find more good information. And grade 9, when high school started, I remember sitting out in the field with he was a kid at the time, Bill Coulter, and we were just chatting about it. And I mentioned something about magic, and he says, "Oh, I took a magic course." And I went, "Magic course? I'm thinking in the high school. What are you talking about?" He goes, "Oh no, this guy," and his name was Doug Basham. I don't know if you remember the name, or he became one of the Pink People, him and Sherry Lucas. And he used to teach magic. So I went home that day. I opened up the phone book, and I found his little back. You remember those in the phone book? They used to have a little for a company at the back in the yellow pages.
Yellow pages, yeah.
And I called him up and I said, "Hey, I'm really interested in learning this magic thing." He said, "Well, unfortunately, I used to teach, but I need a class of at least 8 or more to make it worth my while. And I've never gotten enough students in the last few years, so I'm not doing it anymore." But he made a mistake when he just before he hung up the phone. He said, "If you have any other questions, give me a call." So I spent 2 days thinking of a question, and I called him back. And I called him every day after that for about a week straight, until he finally said, "You really want to learn this magic stuff, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And then he ended up taking me on as a solo private student.
Oh,
So
Wow,
persistence.
I know a lot of listeners are going, Yellow Pages. What are those?
Yeah. So persistence does pay off.
Yes, absolutely. And so, what age would that be roughly?
So grade 9, I think you're what, 14 years old.
Right.
Yeah. So I'd only been 2 years earlier, I saw Doug Hennings perform. And so it all kind of, the timeline was pretty quick.
And so, how in the timeline, when was your first paid show, for example? How long after that would you say it took before you started working and doing shows for a living or for money?
Yeah. So Doug what he would do is once I finished, it took me a year, and I used to ride my bike through the winter, everything I would ride. And it was like an hour and a bit ride up into Hamilton. Like I would take my bike. Wow. And I had this little fanny pack. Remember those back in the day? Those, and I would put all my little sponge balls and my decks of cards in there and my Sony Walkman, and I'd ride all the way up there. Anyway, after I finished the course, he would start, if he got phone calls for like a birthday party or something small that he didn't want or couldn't do, he would pass it on to me. So probably around 15 and a half, I was starting to do real small, like let's not get crazy here, right. But I was starting to do little gigs. And actually I ended up getting my first 2 doves. And I remember wanting to practice that when I would do my shows. And so I maybe wasn't the greatest at training doves when I first started because they were pretty good. But I was doing this is a great story. I was doing a birthday party once and I made the dove appear and he kind of took off. And all the kids were all clapping and he was flying around the room. But he ended up landing right in the kid's birthday cake. And then, of course, when the bird landed there, he got kind of stuck and then he started flapping his wings. And in the end, it was a mess, right? There was birthday cake everywhere. The kid was crying. And yeah, so not all the shows were great back then.
Oh, that's a keeper. That's a good story for sure. And so Magic took you to obviously straight through to high school. And where did competing enter in? Like, where did that enter?
Well, do you remember NICAN conventions? Actually, have you ever been to one? Yeah. So I actually competed NICAN when I was about 16 and a half, somewhere in there. I don't remember the exact age, but I was still in high school and I had learned, like, the course that Doug taught was basically like the Chavez course, all the cards and manipulation and then doves and stuff. So I had this little, 5-minute routine with some multiplying balls, cards, and then 3 or 4 doves by then. And I won first place in that competition. Now there's only, I think, 2 other guys. So it wasn't like, I would have been either gold, silver, or bronze, but I ended up winning. And so that was my first competition. And then it wasn't until 1987, I competed in the New York Symposium in New York City. And I drove to Utica to a friend of mine, Robert Channing's house. He made me set up the act before we went to New York City. I performed it for him and he says to me, "You're going to win. That's the best act I've ever seen." Of course, when you're like 19, you go, "Wow, all right." And then I get there and the meeting starts we're going to the meeting for the competition and the door opens. And this guy walks in that I recognize from seeing some of the videos I've been watching. It was Christopher Hart. And I'm like, "Oh my God, what is he in the competition?" And then I thought to myself, okay, well, second place is still pretty good, right? And then the door opens up and Marco Tempest and Gautier, who used to be United Artists, come walking in. And I'm like, well, okay, third place is not so bad, right? And then a little bit later in the meeting starts another guy walked in with Jeff McBride and with this long blonde hair, and they were buddies. And I'm thinking, I don't know who the guy, it was Kevin James. But before he had the long hair. And so I realized very quickly that I was kind of out of my league. I wasn't quite ready. I still competed. I did okay, but it was sort of a learning lesson that I wasn't quite ready for the big leagues at that point.
No kidding. And so from that routine to like what we all associate with your competition routine, what was that? Big change, small change? How does that look? Well,
it was a big change because here's where is another good story. So I actually ended up getting, so you pick your card to go on the competition, what order you're in. I was the second act. So basically like 9:15 in the morning, I do my act. And then I ran out with my buddy, Robert Channing, and we were in the front row because not a lot of people, I think there was like 12 people at that point in the morning still, right? And then a little bit, but right beside me was Daryl. And I didn't know Daryl back then and at the time. And about a half hour later, maybe 6 or 7 acts in, someone came in between the acts and says to Daryl, "Oh, hey, how's the competition so far?" And I remember the words exactly. He's kind of said, "Most of the acts so far have sucked." And so I realized, okay, I'm one of those acts. So I knew there was a lot of change that had to be done.
Wow.
We and just, we chatted about it later. And, look, in the end of the day, sometimes it's good to hear, it's not pleasant. Nobody wants to hear that but, in the end of the day, if I would have kept thinking that, that act or what I was doing was perfect, it wouldn't have evolved to where it got to. So I think sometimes you've got to be able to accept that harsh reality that maybe you need more work. Maybe the ideas and whatever you think were great aren't great. And that's just one of those things that we have to deal with as a performer, right?
Yeah, it's certainly a skill in its own to work feedback into your life. And
that's a funny thing. And I know you and I have talked about it. I've always got, over the years, a lot of young magicians come up and say, "Hey, I'm going to be in the competition. Tell me what you think of my act." And that's a really dicey, fine line, because do you really want to know, or do you want me to tell you were great? Because if you just want me to tell you you're great, then I can tell you that and we can move on. But if you really want to hear, but the problem is sometimes people don't want to hear, right? And that's the unfortunate side. It's not the most pleasurable thing, but trust me, if you want to get to that level, you're going to hear it a lot and you have to accept it and then be able to understand it and then be able to create and move forward into a new path. If you don't, you're just going to stay right there, right?
It's so true. And could you pinpoint a couple people that maybe gave feedback along your career at the
unknowing to Daryl at the time, Daryl was one of them.
Yeah.
But I actually, for me, after that, I started to go to Tannen's Magic Camp and then Tannen's Jubilee and also Abbott's. And I did there was different people along the way that were very helpful, that would actually, work and sit. I remember Jeff McBride once sitting, even at the 87 symposium, he was very helpful. He would answer any questions. And, back then he was very young. He was the top of the magic world and he didn't have to spend time with me or anyone else, but he did. So yeah, I don't remember all the different people over the years, but there was quite a few. And I was one of those, maybe, I guess, lucky enough that I was able to sit back. It hurt to hear, but I was able to sit back and analyze it and then say, okay, let's correct the path and let's move forward.
And you also create a lot. You've got a lot of ideas in all areas of magic. Do you have a process for this? Like, do you record your ideas? How do you approach that?
So probably around here somewhere, there's at least 1 or 2 books. I'm in one of my offices here. I have one at the theater, but I like to write and put things down. And my writings sometimes aren't like clean. Sometimes it's just jotting and drawing and just quick. And sometimes and even it'll go as far as sometimes it's just shapes. If I'm designing an illusion, I'll design out the shape. And as a matter of fact, like I'm actually, I'm going to try while we're doing this to bring up a quick picture. Because sometimes I do things like, for example, I'll design out an illusion in Fusion 360, which is a 3D modeling program.
Oh yeah.
But some of the illusions, the design comes a lot simpler. So for here example, this is a design that I drew on a piece of paper and then this is the final product, which if you put the two side by side are almost identical. So it sometimes just becomes getting it out of my head and getting it into a visual form that I can see so that then I can start to think about it. But as far as a creative process, the one thing that I think that works really well for me is just simply taking an illusion idea. Like if I want to create a levitation, I like to write down 2 sides of a paper. I like to write down what I like about it and what I dislike about it and just write them side by side. And then take all the things that I like and say, okay, I'm going to keep that into the new routine. And everything else I like, I'm going to try to work to get out of the routine.
Right.
And for example, with Shroud, my Shrouded Transition, which is a metamorphosis, I did that. And one of the things that I really hated about metamorphosis was the first thing you do is you lift up the curtain and you couldn't see the trunk anymore. And I said, okay, I don't want to do that. And which led to the cape. If I didn't write that down, I may not have figured out a different handling of cloth material to get to what the illusion ended up being.
That's great. Yeah, that's really great. And I don't think a lot of people, well, I mean, I've known you for many years, so I know this, but I don't think most magicians know that you're also like an accredited builder. And I need to put an asterisk. I've recently discovered you're an artist as well. Like clearly from the sketch is what reminded me, but you have some artistic talents as well that I've been exposed to recently.
So I'll kind of, sorry, I'm not trying to ignore you. I'm looking up pictures as we're here, but
yeah,
my mom taught art when I was a kid. She did toll painting, and she was very artistic, very, very artistic. And she taught toll painting to the neighbors, and she did all kinds of, half my room here has got different things that she painted. And so I've learned one thing in life is if you believe you can do something, eventually you can do it, because you won't stop until you get to that place. And I think even art, like so many people I hear go, I could never do that. Well, yeah, you could never do that. Once you say you can never do it, you're never going to do it.
Right.
But if you woke up and said, I'm going to do that, I can tell you right now, you would be able to do that. Yeah. So for example, this is, and I try to get that in there.
Amazing.
This is that's about 14-foot tall dragon that I've carved. I carved it all out of foam, and it's now been fiberglass coated, and it's now in the middle of paint. I'm in the middle of painting. But even that I had done clay modeling when I was younger. My daughter now is an amazing clay artist, sculptor. But even at that, I was a little bit, like, okay, can I do this? And I just had to say to myself, yep, I got to do it. I took on the contract. The guy that was supposed to do it backed out on me, and I had no time to find someone new. So it's just one of those things. You have to just get up every day and go, I'm going to do it. I can do it, and be positive about it.
Well, there's a lot of layers to what you just showed. It's not just it's a big size thing too. Like people don't have those skill sets. That's really impressive. Is this a project? Is this something you're working on recently that you can talk about, or is it?
Yeah, so I'm actually helping build a big show in China. I'm working on 6 full pieces that are all big and somewhat original, I'll say, like maybe not 100% everything original. I'm just trying to find the carving of the head to show you how it starts.
Yeah.
But it's been a long process because it's not only that I'm the magic consultant on this, so I'm trying to consult them through the process. It's easy to say, okay, I'm just going to build you this prop and then not think about anything else they have to do at the other end. Right. But one of the things that I've always wanted to do as a semi-retired kind of thing is to get into more of that consulting side of it, because I just love the creative process all the way around.
And you know all the aspects of it, because I remember, like, when I first met you many, 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 many years ago, I was the introduction of possibly welding, of teaching welding, and you said a statement to me about like 10,000 hours to learn how to do this stuff, which I remember to this day. And so you have all those skill sets that really complement for something.
Yeah, and you know what it is too. Like part of it was I had to do it because of. I grew up in Stony Creek and my parents didn't have a lot of money. I actually heard a rumor once that people were saying that I was a millionaire and I got all this money from my family to buy all these illusions. What they didn't know was I wasn't buying a lot of illusions. I was building them. And because of the fact that everything was in American dollars, then it had to get, shipped up from California. Then it had to cross customs and duties. I had to have road cases. I couldn't afford that kind of stuff. So I learned to do a lot of this by I say the need, but I had no other option. It was either learn and put the time in or go without. And so just to go back to the sculpture, that's, I hope this zooms in right.
Wow.
That's it when it's being carved. That's in its rough form. So that's just raw foam there. And yeah, there's a lot of detail in this.
How long would that have taken?
So the head itself was about 3 full days of just carving. And I mean, the great thing about foam is it's soft, so it carves quick. but that's also a disadvantage because it carves.
Oops.
Oops. So it's not a dragon anymore.
Right.
I guess it's a snake. It's like balloon animals, right? Oops, pop. Oh, okay.
Right. Yeah. Well, and speaking of building, like you literally built from the ground up your own theater, which is at the top of the hill in Niagara Falls. How, everyone dreams of having their own theater. Is it a dream?
Well, just before we actually started we were in place to start to build the theater, and I was still living in Vegas, and I remember going to see Lance, and I was hanging out with him in his green room, and I said to him, and I was very proud. I was like, "Hey, Lance," because in a lot of ways I kind of, I really respected Lance and his career and what he had done, and I kind of, not maybe purposely, but kind of followed in his footsteps in a way, and in a sense, having my own show and my own theater and whatnot. And I remember saying to him, "Oh, Lance, I'm so excited. We're going to open my own theater." And in Lance's real sort of casual but very like cool way, he just sat there and went, "Well, Greg, be careful what you wish for." And I was like, "What are you talking about? This is careful. This woohoo!" And then years later, I kind of understood what he was talking about. In other words, it's not for everybody. It's a lot of work, a lot of behind the scenes stuff that nobody sees. I've got 60 employees. It's a lot of managing of people, managing of money. There's a lot going on that no one ever sees. The magicians come to the show. It's easy for the magicians to say, "Oh, I could do this," or "This is easy," or "Look at that," or "He's making millions," or there's all these things they'll say, but what they don't know is all the things behind the scenes and what really happens. So very interesting. And yes, we did build it from the ground up, basically. It was a square shell building, but we spent 6 months in there. We helped with building up the framework for the concrete, from electrical. I mean, I got to do almost every trade to help get the project done in a quicker time and with less money. So we were really hands-on through the whole thing.
Yeah, and your full restaurant, conference center, theater, it's really
That's right.
quite a location. And for those that can visit, should visit. How many years have you been fully operational now?
16. Almost, we're going in our 17th year this spring. So Now, a year of that, we were kind of locked down. But at the end of the day, that's still part of the business. We had to, people say, "Well, do you count that?" Well, sure I do. Yeah, we weren't doing shows, but I still had to manage the business, manage the company, manage everything else, and keep it, from not being there, right? So.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. I've only been exposed to a sliver of it, and which is probably more than most listening, but it's an intense lifestyle. And you also bring in shows, and you have, it's really an incredible theater that you've got there, and all your partnerships. And people don't see that side of it, but they should come and visit and see it firsthand.
Well, I appreciate that.
And in the show, of course, you also have animals. Animals have been a big part of your life. You're also on the board for the SPCA in the Niagara region. So just right off the bat, I'd be curious, what do you want magicians to know about working with animals?
Well, I think there's a lot of magicians that understand that, that some people there are people that do this in the right way. And unfortunately, with any industry that work with animals, there's a lot of people that do it the wrong way, meaning, they are a drawing card. They do bring business to the show, but I have to look at them as family and as also, I got to treat them as no different than I would treat my dancers, my family, my backstage crew. They're part of the team. They're not just an object. So they're part of my family. They live with me here at the house, not in the house, and they're a lot of work. So, there's an interesting thing that I don't think people understand is there are passionate people that take this very seriously and treat the animals with the utmost respect. And unfortunately, it's the ones that don't, that make a bad, a bad image for us, right? So it's sad. And I'm not, look at the gentleman in the Bowmanville Zoo that started the abuse on the tigers and it got out on video. I was the first one to call up the Ontario SPCA and say, "What's going on? What are you going to do?" And that's sort of how my relationship started with them. And when I was told by the lady that I talked to, said basically to me, well, is that not how you train your tigers? And I was really offended at first, which, but then I thought about it and went, well, people don't really understand. They don't know. They just assume that's how everything's done. So I brought them in. I said, bring your full staff in, anyone you want in the next few days so we don't have time to plan, whatever, and come and see how we work and train and handle our animals. And so they brought a whole crew in, film crew, everything. And we sat and we walked around, did some training, and I talked about them, and they got to see them. And the first reaction that they said to me was, because they've been watching the videos of the other guy, and the first thing they said to me is, it's amazing how calm they are and how relaxed they are. I said, sure, why would they not be? There's no reason for them not to be relaxed. I don't abuse them. I don't beat them. I don't hit them. There's no reason they wouldn't be. It's no different than a dog or a cat. They're treated with respect. They treat you back with respect. So I guess that's the thing that I think I would love people to really understand. It's no different than any other thing that people put a label on it, and then you just become this guy that, oh, he's got tigers. Oh, I'm not going to go see that show. He abuses them. Oh, that's not fair. But I get it. There's, that stigma out there. So I spent a lot of time trying to go against that and try to educate people and understand that that's not with everybody,
And what are some of the animals that you have? Tell us about.
Well, we have 4 tigers that are in the show. We have a couple of different macaws and a cockatoo. I've got I have 4 rescue dogs here at the house. 2 of them one of them is going into the show now. He's still pretty young. And my other rescue dog, she's been in the show now for 7-8 years. We've got Chuck the duck, and of course, doves that I don't do the full bird act anymore for the moment. It will be going back in at some point. Yep. But I, of course, got the doves that I'm known for. Yep. So I think I said them all. I think that's all the animals.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's quite a menagerie.
Yeah, it's enough. And of all of those animals, the most difficult to take care of and the ones that I hate cleaning the most are those damn ducks. They're the messiest animal you'll ever meet.
It sounds like a good place to leave it right there. Greg, thanks so much for an amazing chat. This has been Thank you.
I appreciate it, Ryan.
We sure do hope you enjoyed this episode of Magicians Talking Magic. Don't forget to join us in Discord. You can find those links in the description. And hit that subscribe button, whether on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app. We'd love to continue this chat with you each and every week here on Magicians Talking Magic. On behalf of Grimazing and myself, Shablazum and Tadoozle, we'll see you on the next episode.